as I'm going through it, feel free to ask as I'm going through stuff, because some of it's easier to go through while we're talking about it than to come and wrap back around to it. So just kind of generically speaking, have any of you ever had to call the ambulance for any issues yet?
Once.
Once? Sure. Generically speaking, we get called a ton for simple tip-ups, regardless of whether it's from ALS or 1,000 other different things people can have issues with at home. Usually it's just elderly that are too weak to stand up. We get probably 30 to 40% of our calls on a day-to-day basis are that exact thing. We're just going out to get people off the floor is what it amounts to. So what we usually recommend, if you guys do need to call an ambulance, or you think you need to, or if you don't know if you need to, our usual best guess is call 911 and we'll sort it out from there. So usually if you do call 911, they're going to ask a bunch of questions anyway and decide whether or not, what services they think you need at that time. Typically for us, I know a lot of people worry about cost being a big thing of the ambulance coming out. Generically speaking, if we come out just to help somebody get up off the floor or do something like that, we don't charge until it becomes a recurring event. And usually for us in Chippewa Falls, you have to call us more than 5 times in a calendar year. So between January and December, if we show up more than 5 times just to do a simple lift up pickup, then it's still pretty cheap. It's like $75 a call after that just for coming out. But usually the rule of thumb I tell people is it's still a lot cheaper than a nursing home or paying someone to live in house, that type of stuff. That, it is what it is. So, and we also recommend, if someone does fall down, the pendants, push buttons, medical alarms, that type of stuff works fantastic if you don't have a phone with you or anything like that. Those work great because you can hit your pendant. A lot of them have fall detection on them. So that even say you fall down, hit your head on the way down, you don't have to be able to push your button to get help. It'll automatically call for help. So, and those, if nobody's familiar with them, pendants or wrist bracelets are the most common nowadays. And usually if somebody falls down with it on, it'll sense the fall. That company will call you and ask if you're okay. If you don't respond, they automatically call us and dispatch us to that location. So that type of stuff comes in super handy. Other than that, as far as like general stuff to prepare for ahead of time, I don't know. Is there anything that anybody has big worries about with calling the ambulance right off the bat? Not necessarily in particular.
Yeah, sometimes not everybody that maybe had the question last month has come on this month, but yep. I know somebody we had on a couple of times ago, she lives alone and she was worried about that very thing. If Definitely. I can't get to the phone, will they come? Where will they know where to find me in my house? That kind of thing.
Yeah, and some simple stuff relating to that as well, as far as say you are home alone, we get called to that location, wherever that device or phone call comes from. It's not uncommon for doors on the house to be locked. So what we recommend is if you think it's going to be an issue to get to the door at some point, that 2 things you can do. One, either have a hide a key somewhere where you can, if you are able to talk to dispatch when you call and tell them where that key is. The other thing that has become more common is people get a tiny little lock box and mount it to the outside of their house, like by their front door, and it's just got little push pins on it. And they'll give that code to their dispatch center for the local area. And that way, if anybody's ever called to that address, they can give it to the police, ambulance, fire department, whatever. And we don't have to break your door to get in your house. We can grab a key out of there and just unlock the door. So that is a really handy way to do it. Usually it's more of a, if you're going to be home a lot or someone's home a lot, they don't think they might not be able to get to the door. That's a really good preventative measure ahead of time. The other big thing for preventative stuff we recommend is you have a list of any medications and known allergies, known health problems typed up on a sheet somewhere. And usually couple places you can go with that. The big one we used to actually push in Chippewa here was to have it right on your freezer door of your fridge, right top and center. So if we go looking for it, that's where we told everybody in our nursing homes, you know, assisted living homes, put it right there. That's the first place we're going to check when we come in if you're not able to talk to us. So that still generally applies. Otherwise, medical issues, if there's no one else around, we just kind of treat what we see. So, and that can go a full gamut. I know with ALS, there's stuff where speaking might be an issue, movement might be an issue. That we just kind of take it as we can go. We deal with it when we get there. It's not uncommon to run across varying issues one way or the other. So as far as suggesting transport, if anybody's having issues when we do show up, we kind of leave it up to any caregivers. If we can get a hold of them that might have an idea, okay, how far off of the normal is this that we're seeing today? Because that can be a huge range. You know, some people, whatever's going on might be very close to their normal. And to us, it looks like a big issue, but that could be how they live every day. So what we usually look for is more of how much of a change is there today versus any other day that normally they're having interactions. So otherwise, I know the other question that I did have in the notes here is home safety tips. So for us, it's kind of a generic blanket safety for just about anyone. Usually removing trip hazards is a huge thing. And it's a lot of stuff people don't think of as trip hazards. Chair legs, rugs is probably the biggest thing in any house that takes people down to the floor all the time. And usually it's just you walk over it 100 times, but that 101st time you trip on the corner and that's how you end up on the floor today. So again, that's the type of stuff, again, where the medical alert bracelets come in handy because you might not be carrying your phone as you're walking across from one side of the room to the other. And that really can save you a lot of grief. So those I definitely recommend. Otherwise, codes. Any other generic questions? That's kind of mostly the preventative and from our end of stuff. Basic rule of thumb, don't be afraid to call 911. We can come out and check you out. Most of the time, it's not going to cost you anything to have us swing out there and take a look at you. So that's definitely worth your while. The other one we run into is people not wanting to call 911 because they're embarrassed because their neighbors are going to see the ambulance there or something. Longer you stay laying on the floor, the more issues it causes. So it can go from a real simple, well, you just needed help getting up to, well, now you got to spend a night in the hospital because your labs are messed up from laying on the floor and you have all kinds of muscle issues from being cramped. The other big thing that a lot of people don't think of is cold in the winter. Even just laying on the floor, if it's a cement floor or a cool floor, you can actually get hypothermia pretty darn quick, even in a normal temperature house. So I know we're finally coming out of that cold snap here, so hopefully that's not a big issue going forward, but it is something to think about as well. So any other questions today?
One question I have, Dave, is occasionally we've had people who have spoken on this topic who have recommended that, especially if there's issues with being able to communicate verbally and things like that, that people reach out in advance to their local emergency department or fire department and just kind of make sure that the family is on their radar as having these issues so that they know what they're walking into. What are your thoughts on that?
Yep, and that you definitely can do as well. The two things that tie into that we do in Chippewa Falls here is, one, we definitely more than happy to hear from anyone that is in the local area here and wants to call and let us know. Give us a heads up for whatever address you're normally at. And also our dispatch center has a way to put notes in there based off of home addresses. So if they know it's an ongoing issue or you might run into that, we give them some of that basic info. Be like, hey, if we get called here, it could potentially be this type of issue. Just be aware. So we kind of get a little heads up of what we might be walking into there.
Is that the case
Sarah,
with when there's...
You're on mute, Sarah.
Oh.
I just wondered how that works. It seems like that'd be a good idea to call up and tell our local guys, you know, my husband can't talk very well at all anymore. It's going to sound like he's drunk or whatever.
Sure.
But if you guys do come out, if it's in the notes, like, how does Auburn know that in the notes it says?
So what you'll see for a lot of those outlying departments like that, the little small town departments might not have their own in-house version of it, but a lot of them get sent through the same dispatch center. So like for this area here, for Chippewa Falls, if you call 911, it goes to the dispatch center right in the city of Chippewa, and that covers all of Chippewa County. So that's everywhere, even if it's little towns versus us where we're staffed 24 hours a day. As long as they put it in their notes, they'll let the fire department or the ambulance know when they're responding, and they'll just tell them that right when they dispatch them out.
That's good to know.
Does that work the same with power outages, like when they have equipment that isn't working because of an emergency? Or
Sure, you can do that as well if there's any specialized equipment in the house that they need to operate on a normal day-to-day basis. If it's reliant on anything like power in particular, some of that stuff has batteries that only last X amount of time after it loses power. That type of stuff is good to know as well. That is something that could turn into an emergency down the road. So that's the same thing. If there is something specific like that, it can definitely, that can be added to the notes for that location as well. So, and typically in town here, we recommend anybody can call us right at the station, because we'll put it in our notes here for our dispatch, and then we'll also actually call and talk to our dispatch center and let them know that we took notes on that. So that way they'll have it for down the road. And a lot of times what you'll see, our dispatch not only calls us for emergencies, but a lot of times they have to contact power companies and utilities and stuff if something goes wrong. So if they have that address, they know it's flagged for a certain issue, then they can pass that down when they're making those calls.
That's what we did.
Yeah, and that works very well. It's good to have that stuff ahead of time. It can really tell us a lot of where we're going and what we're getting into before we show up, so we're not blindsided by something when we walk in. And it also gives us a few minutes to prepare. You know, if we got to call somebody else to get something lined up while we're on the way there, then it gives us time to do that.
Of course, my social worker,
Go ahead.
Am I speaking out of turn? I said, of course, my social work brain goes to work here. You know, we mainly talk about leaving information about the ALS patient, but it's also very important to leave information about yourself as a caregiver, because if you're the one that falls and your med list isn't on the refrigerator, it's as equally as important for those that are living with living with somebody else. Because how often do we see that oftentimes it's the caregiver that is tired and trips or has an incident, and then maybe they can't speak. So
touching on the caregiver, I guess one sort of in feedback to you, Dave, and just for people, you know, who are in a circumstance, obviously when you're in an emergency and somebody's fallen or hurt or choking or whatever the circumstance is, everybody is anxious, is just the importance of that caregiver doing the best that you can to kind of catch a deep breath and try to communicate well with the responders, because they're really going to rely oftentimes on you, again, assuming, as Jen pointed out, that it's not the caregiver that's the one down. And so one piece of information on that sort of the health response is, I know that it's pretty common for oxygen to be used in the ambulance just for comfort measures, just as it is often with hospice. And just kind of a tip, I know that in some of the information we have with ALS, we try to emphasize the fact that oxygen can be contraindicated in the sense that for many people, the issue is just it's just as difficult for them to expel carbon dioxide as it is for them to take oxygen in, and they can get kind of a high concentration of carbon dioxide if they're getting a lot of infusion of oxygen. So that's just something that we kind of want to make sure responders are aware of in those situations. Yeah,
and so what you'll see along with that, especially in the city here, we're pretty much all either paramedics or critical care paramedics. So most of us are very familiar with that. As far as like oxygen goes, the old throw oxygen on everybody and blast them in the face with it is good for everyone is not really the case anymore. You might still see that a little bit with some of the small rural departments where they just don't get a lot of run response. They might still lean that way. Us, we're only going to throw it on if you absolutely need it. So that's usually not something too much to worry about with us. And we also switch our monitoring, not so much just the SpO2 percentage that everybody's familiar with. We also use end-tidal carbon dioxide sensors when so we'll line the two up. If we think you're low, we're going to give you a little bit, but we don't blast everybody like we used to. So that should be a small worry at this point.
Good to hear. So if nobody has other immediate questions, I thought maybe it would be helpful for Angie to pull up just so those links that I had emailed out, just while we have Dave still here, in case there's anything that triggers for him to reflect for us. So this is one of the links that I had sent, and it's just, again, recognizing that when we're looking ahead and trying to reduce stress, having a plan in place for if an emergency happens in advance of it happening, just gives you some peace of mind. So this sheet that she has, she's just going to scroll through, again, just kind of talks about making a plan. Make sure that your information that you have with whether it's the meds that people are on or instructions for communication or otherwise are clearly spelled out and accessible. That emergency information list, who to call. Again, medical information that has any doctors, medical contacts, that instructions on dosage, things of that nature that would be helpful to a first responder. Make sure you have enough medications on hand, evacuation routes. We're fortunate in Wisconsin that we don't generally have hurricanes or, some of the kinds of superstorms that a lot of places have, but we do get tornadoes and we do get power outages. And so it's just, again, good to be prepared. A go bag can be helpful just so that you're prepared for if something were to happen, everything is nice and handy. There's like number 10 there, accessible transportation. Number 16, is that 9, 10, 16? I'm not sure who did the numbering there. Anyway, something got left out there. But again, just trying to remember that communication is important, and trying to be calm as much as you can is important.
Yeah, and one other thing I did see on that list as far as like wheelchairs and movement, if anyone does require a wheelchair to get around, usually what we're going to do, if we do show up with the ambulance, big powered wheelchairs we can't bring with us. We just don't have room to pack it in there. But if you do have a collapsible, foldable wheelchair, most of the time we can break that down and bring it in the ambulance to the hospital with us. So you do have something to get back home with once you're hopefully getting discharged. So just a minor little side tip on that one. And also our thing kind of tied into that as far as getting you in and out of your house. If you don't have an easy ramp or something like that, we do have what we call a stair chair here. It's kind of like a wheelchair, except it's got some extra rails and stuff on. So we can get you up and down stairs and in and out of anywhere that you might be at that time. So pretty easy for us to, if you're down in a basement or something, we can get you up and out of there without any issues.
So Dave, would that be the case? Let's say we called you and we came to the ER and we spent 8 hours in the ER and we need to get back home, but we can't get in a regular vehicle. Will you come as a non-emergency ambulance and bring us back home?
So it's kind of a tricky deal when we get those calls. Every once in a while, we do field a call for that. Typically, we try to find other ways for people to get home besides us. because usually it's not covered by any sort of insurance or anything. And, you know, your basic ambulance bill just for sitting in the back and taking a ride somewhere is probably $900 to $1,000 minimum. So it's usually a lot easier to get a wheelchair van and have them take those types of patients home. Usually about the only ones that we do return transports back to a living facility is like the assisted living houses around here. Some of them we're contracted to do that with. And then otherwise it pretty much is going to be, usually it's a hospice only type thing. We'll take somebody home on hospice and it's pre-approved and all that type of stuff. So otherwise just a regular trip home. Usually we don't do those. There are a few services around that may, but usually it's a pay out of pocket thing before they'll even think about it. So.
Other questions for Dave? Or observations or reflections on experiences any of you have had?
When we came home from the hospital with the trach, we came home with a little gadget that if you had to call emergency places, you could call and then press that number or press the button and it would have a recording saying who you were, that where your address is, that you're on a trach, which they already, you know, I notified them about that before, but then we also have that to use.
Yep.
So that was kind of handy.
Sure. Yeah. And that type of stuff can, especially if you're new to having a trach or something like that, that type of stuff's very helpful. Especially the other thing we fall back on sometimes when we show up on scene is if someone can still write halfway decent, we can usually communicate that way as well to get information out of them. Trachs can be tricky. Sometimes they have little speaker valves on them, so the patient can still talk even with the trach in. Otherwise, we deal with vented patients a lot here because we have a vent center right in town that we transport a lot of patients. So we're very familiar with it, but you know, the next town over, they don't deal with that at all on the ambulance, so they might not be familiar. So that type of stuff is kind of good for them to brush up on, which again comes back to informing your service. If you know that you have that going on, call the fire station, ambulance, let them know that ahead of time, and they'll be a lot more aware of it before they show up. So.
Any other questions or comments for Dave? Well, I really appreciate you joining us and sharing those insights and those experiences and those tips and suggestions. It's